You're listening to If Only I Were Wiser podcast, where Reyna Wilson brings together wisdom and raw life stories to provide encouragement and truth. So many times it's easy to become discouraged in your own pursuit of health because your story or circumstances look drastically different from your favorite influencer or even the expectations you had for yourself. If that is you, welcome! This space is for you to learn, breathe, and maybe just listen and see what wellness could look like for you. Hey friends, welcome back to the If Only I Were Wiser podcast. I'm super excited about this episode. I've been in kind of like a podcast funk, which you guys know, which makes these episodes all the sweeter because I just bring in Joseph and we talk about things that are important in our lives, things that we walk through. And this one, I almost wish we could have titled it Your Marriage Won't Ever Work Out, because it's like one of the things that I heard and one of the things that people spoke over us when we were engaged. That being said, during our engagement season, it was one of the most difficult seasons of our life. And we're going to get into it because this episode is all about boundaries. So, Joseph, do you want to introduce yourself?
For those of you that are new and have not heard me introduce myself, I've been married to Reyna for 4.5 years now. I'll be 5 this December. And currently in the Army, been in the Army for 5.5 years, and I kind of just drag Reyna around all over the country so that I can play in the woods.
I love that. They play laser tag kind of things, and it's just fine. We're fine. We love the Army life. It sucks our soul out of our bodies sometimes, but honestly, like, thinking back to our engagement season and, we had that conversation pretty early on, I wouldn't change it, Okay, so let's go into it. I'm going to explain a little bit of just the big picture of our engagement season. Joseph was I guess you can explain your side of things. I'll just explain my perspective of things. So, I was working full-time with my dream job in student ministry in Texas, and it was really sweet. I loved what I was doing. I loved the people I was with. I loved the students I was interacting with, and it was honestly one of the sweetest answers to prayer. But our engagement season was just so difficult because I had so many voices in our life and in roles of authority, especially spiritual authority, which made it just a little bit more messy, that instead of it really coming out as a season to celebrate where we felt loved and supported, I felt like I had to fight for Joseph every minute of every day in probably not the most professional settings and even in professional settings. So without getting into too much detail about that, do you want to just share maybe your broad strokes of our engagement season?
Yeah, so I graduated college May 2019, and then at that point, Reyna and I had kind of already decided where we were heading with our relationship in regards to it's headed towards marriage. Pretty
early on too.
Hadn't really decided on a date or a time period. We just kind of knew that that's where we were headed. And if we didn't think we were headed there, then we, probably would have ended the relationship a few months prior to that.
Yeah.
So that's where we were at May of 2019. Mm-hmm. And so for the remainder of the year, I drove down to Fort Hood for 2 weeks, doing Army school, drove back up to Fort Worth, and then spent a week there, and then drove to Kentucky, spent a couple months there, doing some random things, and then ended up in then Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, Georgia, where I spent a year in the remainder of 2019 and the rest of our engagement season. Mm-hmm. So that's where I was during all this time period, and then Reyna was still back in Texas in Fort Worth with her family and with her job.
So like I said, without giving too many specifics of what we had walked through during that season, we just heard a lot of noise. We heard it from people. We heard it from friends, we heard it from family, we heard it from trusted spiritual authority that was just giving us the statistics of did you know that 50% of military marriages end in divorce? Which I'm pretty sure that's not even the statistic.
No, it's 2%, 2 or 3%.
But I had a phone call with somebody that just spoke that over us, and I had so many people that had, asked us about our spiritual health, which we'll kind of get into that, is the influence and perspective of which we approach marriage. is through a biblical lens. And so people asking us like, do you know that he's Christian enough for you? Like, are you sure this is what you want? Isn't there a lot of brokenness that's going on in your life? Because at the time my parents were going through a pretty rough divorce. And then Joseph's dad had just passed from cancer. So there were major things that were going on in our life, or had just recently like passed within the last like 6 months that we met. And, we decided like, hey, like if we're going to do this thing, we're going to do this thing. So I'll admit like things progressed fairly quickly. Like Joseph and I met in February of 2019. We were graduating in May of 2019. He commissioned in May of 2019. And by that time, like I knew he was my husband. And so we made the plans, because I think on our second date, Joseph was like, I'm doing the army thing. I don't know how long I'm going to do the army thing, but if we're going to do this for the long haul, then we need to start talking about marriage and what that looks like, because the army thing also dictates like our timeline for when we can even get married. So I was already looking at wedding dresses before he even proposed come July, and he didn't propose till August. So it was just kind of this whirlwind of a season for us where we felt like we really, really, really had to fight for each other. And several of those ways I think that we can talk about is setting boundaries, how we did that, why we did that, and what did that look like biblically. So I'm going to give some of the things that I pulled out of that season in particular in terms of boundaries, and what I learned through that season in particular with the conversations that we had with those friends, family, and trusted counselors, because we had to have some really, really hard conversations. Like I had to look best friends in the eye and be like, if you do not stand with me because of these things, then like, I don't know if we can be friends. And that was a boundary that I had to set. And so one of those things that I think Joseph and I learned really early on in terms of boundaries is that we had to fight for each other first. And I say fight for each other first through a biblical lens and biblical application. So one of those things, when we heard the noise of like, are you sure you should get married? Are you doing all the right things? Like, are you walking in sin? I wish I had set those boundaries clearer with those people that were asking those questions, because one, outside of our like most intimate people that were walking with us during that season, nobody should really had the, I would say, like not even spiritual authority, but like relational equity to speak that over us. So that, I will admit, is a boundary I had missed. And I think back that I had learned from that season was because I think we could have set more boundaries, because outside of the people that were walking intimately with us, others shouldn't have said the things that they said, because we should have set the boundary that was like, hey, we love you. We appreciate your voice in this. But at the end of the day, like, you don't make the decision. So if you're going to stand with us, stand with us. But if not, then like, peace out otherwise. And I say we did that lovingly, because in some of those hard conversations, we went to scripture. And so I think that's one of the biggest foundations I think we laid for each other and for our marriage was, what does scripture say about this thing? What does scripture say about this decision? What does scripture say about this season of life or opportunity that we have? Joseph and I had to sit across from each other, not really because we were doing long distance at the time, but really just sit with each other and say, okay, what does scripture say about getting married young? And we sat, we prayed, we went through scripture, and this is what we pulled out. What does scripture say about, sex before marriage? We sat, we prayed, we went through it, which we believe that sex is saved exclusively for marriage. What does scripture say about military life? Not that kind of explicitly, but it's like, what does it say about cleaving from your mother and father, or leaving from your mother and father and cleaving to your husband? So these were things that I learned personally that, one, I wish I had set better boundaries looking back, but these are the things that I learned coming from that season was, one, I can set boundaries and I can have hard conversations, and the Lord can redeem hard conversations. And you may lose people, but ultimately I think the biggest encouragement for me coming out of the season is we learned the discipline and practice of going to scripture for big things that matter and making the decisions together, regardless of what anybody else had to say.
Yeah, and so I'm a person, I don't like to view things in this tiny silo of excellence. I kind of like to make sure things are applicable or make sense in other areas. So like what really Reyna is talking about is making sure that you know what you believe and why. And so this topic, for what we're talking about, the Bible was that foundation. If you work in like the medical field or whatever, it's probably science. If you're in the army, it's probably whatever publication or document your organization has. And that's really what you stand on. And so you can't enforce your boundaries unless you have something to stand on and to look back. We've all had that, brief or presentation that we gave in college or in a class or in a professional setting where you speak words and inside your head you're just like, I really hope no one asks me a single question because I don't know what I'm talking about. So a lot of people do that, and so that's why boundaries can often come across as like this woke or like new, like just tiny Hartsville thing that people create. And really, boundaries is just a different word for having interpersonal tact that's really just like known to the other person. I think that's really like to me what boundaries are. Boundaries are things you probably have with like pretty close friends and family that know you, and like the interpersonal tact is probably just slang for what we use when we don't know these people. Of like, oh hey, he's got good body language, he's got good verbal, always making eye contact, good interpersonal tact, makes you feel comfortable and knows how to interact with you. For your friends and family, when it gets personal or doesn't, that's kind of where I start to think of things like these are the boundaries of where I should and shouldn't go when discussing certain things.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Like boundaries, to me, like definition wise, is like not necessarily like the hard drawing lines in the sand, but clear communication that allows both parties to understand what the outcome is. And I think we've learned not only in our engagement season, both in almost 5 years of marriage and then parenthood, is like without clear and consistent communication, things fall apart. Like even with Ledger, like please, please do not leave the garage, or like please not leave the backyard. That's a big thing that he's learned to do, is like the boundary is do not leave the backyard, because one, I don't trust where you're gonna go and you're gonna leave, but also like for your safety right now, like our neighbor's dogs will be out, or our other neighbor found snakes on the hill that they play on, so like it's for his safety. But unless we approach Ledger and talk to him explicitly and said do not leave the backyard because of A, B, and C, he would be totally confused as to why Joseph and I get freaked out every time he leaves the backyard, had we not like set that boundary.
And a perfect example, real life example of what happens when boundaries are not kept, when I tell Ledger, hey, don't go out the fence, because we keep the back door open, just so we can hear him, so that he can like play by himself. But I will hear the metal clang whenever he opens up the latch on the gate. So he went out. So I was like, all right, cool. I go back there, pick him up. He's 30 pounds. I'm 200. And then plop him back inside the fence. And then I go in the garage and just grab a lock and I throw it on there. And he is just absolutely distraught.
Yeah.
That why I would put a lock on there when he is just so loving and kind and listening. And it's obviously a joke because he escapes every time we go inside.
Yeah.
But it's a perfect example of what happens when you or your friends don't, or whoever, step across that boundary and you're like, I told you so. And you're looking at them from across the room, don't do this, and they do that thing.
Yeah.
And then you go and put your own, metaphorical lock on yourself emotionally or physically, just be cutting that person off completely. Like that's precisely what happens when boundaries are not respected and or crossed, because those can be two different things. Like you can respect somebody's boundaries but still be, you can not cross somebody's boundaries but still be very disrespectful in the handling of that boundary.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the next question that we want to cover is like, how do we decide that a situation needs boundaries? And Joseph already kind of touched on like the emotional turmoil that you might be feeling in a situation. So for example, If I don't feel at peace in a situation, if I feel uncomfortable or I feel hurt, or I would say like even within our marriage specifically, because we'll touch on friends and family, like if something bothers me or Joseph said something or I don't know. A simple boundary could be like, hey, can you put your shoes in the shoe closet and not by the front door because as soon as we walk in, we'll like trip on the front door. Or even the simple boundary of like, hey, we don't wear shoes in our house. We don't wear shoes in our house because it's like tracks and gross stuff and that's like a non-toxic crunchy thing. But that's a simple boundary that we have for our home is we ask people to remove their shoes when they enter the home. And I would say going back to the original question of how do we decide that something needs a boundary, I would say usually for me it's like an emotional thing. So I'm curious, are you, I mean, you're not like emotionally driven like women are, but how do you decide a situation needs boundaries?
Yeah, for me, it's if there's not a result in the near future. What I mean by that is like if Reyna and I have a disagreement or we just think differently on a certain thing, then that will kind of be like the trigger for us to realize, okay, maybe we don't talk about this for like a little while, or maybe we just ask the person, do you not want me to talk about this? You know, should we talk about this in a couple weeks? Do you want me to like send you like thoughts or like articles or whatever on X, Y, and Z topic? You know, depending on what we're talking about or like what the actual boundary is. So sometimes it's just kind of leaving it be and just realizing I don't think I'm ready to tackle this thing right now, and we just need to like not worry about it. And that happens in a bunch of like very, very small ways. You know, like I kind of mentioned in a previous podcast, I take, you know, mistakes or like failures pretty seriously. So like whenever that happens, like I'd rather not talk about it. I'd rather just be angry for like maybe 24, 48 hours. And then I'll figure my life out. But for that first little bit, I don't want your sympathies because to me, it doesn't do me any good. I should have just been better. You know, that's kind of how I take it for like the first 24, 48 hours. So I don't always need like, or I don't always want like help or sympathy in those first, for in the you know the first few hours or days of X, Y, and Z thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So would you say it's like it is emotional component of like when you need boundaries, but I think for you it's also an evaluation of like how you're feeling and the context of the situation.
Yeah, it's what I think I need in that moment, which can also sometimes be dangerous because we don't always know what we need.
Yeah.
But yeah, it really it's emotional in the aspect of what do I think is the best thing for me in the next little bit.
Yeah. Which I mean, we're still learning this area, guys, so don't take our words as like Bible truth, but I think boundaries really come down to willing to have the conversation with yourself of like, what do you need personally and almost selfishly? And this conversation is really like how we do that in the context of marriage. So I think one of the things that we can talk about is like, how do we set boundaries with friends and how do we set boundaries with family? Because I think they look similar, but like really different in a lot of ways, because I think the kind of boundaries and like the way that you set them all is contingent on a relational equity, like the depth of your relationship with that person. Like Joseph has the most intimacy and most relational equity in my life because he's my husband and my partner, versus like a very, very close friend of mine. Like I can still set boundaries with, but it's gonna be totally different between my husband or even like my family and extended family. So I think we can start with friends. What would you say are some of the main things that are important when setting boundaries with friends specifically?
For me, it's really like a thought process. So it first comes down to like what is the character of that friend. Some friends might have better character than others, you know, better traits, better values, and those traits and values lead to me trusting them more. So the boundary that they get might be different than the boundary that someone else gets. Doesn't mean that I don't get along with that person the same. It just means that I don't trust them with personal information as much. And so that's really what it comes down to for the friend aspect, and that really just comes down to like the exposure that I get with them, and by exposure I mean like the experiences that I have with them. There are individuals that I met this year that I've shared more with than individuals that I met 3 years ago. and that I worked, in the same office with for a year and a half on a day-to-day basis. And that's just, once again, based on their character, that I don't trust them with certain information based on, the things that they do or believe. Because I don't think that they would hold the same values that I do. And, that can be slightly judgmental at times, 100%. But once again, that boundary is also based on the biblical aspect of my boundary is set here because of, what the Bible discusses. And if that person doesn't really believe in that boundary, well, I'm just not even going to let them get close to that boundary, because then it gets rather difficult to make someone believe in something. To make someone believe in a boundary that, they don't even think should exist.
Mm-hmm. I think with friends, I think Joseph is explaining, the image of circles. So, I've explained it maybe on the show before, and there's a book called Circles that talks about this in particular. Building your wisdom table is, in the innermost, bullseye of the circle should be the people that are rooted in your values, know you most intimately, and walk with you on a pretty consistent basis. So, the criteria for my wisdom table is they have to be biblically based, know me and love me, and that I do trust with my husband and my son. I'd say that's not the only criteria, but those are the things that come to mind. And so each circle, outside of that, you extend your threshold of what you're willing to accept based on the relational equity, that they have in your life. So the people in my innermost circle know me the best, and so my boundaries with them, I would say I approach everyone with boundaries the same as clear communication, clear consequences for the boundary, and consistent communication of the boundaries. But since those people that are walking with me most intimately probably know me the best, I don't have to set as many boundaries with them as maybe people that are on my third tier or third ring of my circle, because they know what I do and don't like, and what I do and don't want to participate in.
And making those boundaries can be really awkward.
Yeah. I think it's more awkward with friends than it is with family to set boundaries.
Yeah, it definitely can be. I'd say probably just because you've spent, obviously, your entire life around your family. And so if you're 26 like we are, you're now asking your family to do something that, they literally haven't done for 26 years. It's quite literally the first time you're ever asking them to do this thing. So it would just be kind of weird, because that opens up a lot of questions for them to ask, and it's kind of just the annoying part of setting boundaries of well, I don't want this to be a big deal. And there are a lot of other areas where we compensate for that aspect in life of not wanting to be confrontational. Mm-hmm. It's one of the reasons why I married Reyna, so that way when my order from the restaurant comes out wrong, she can be like, yo, this is not right. Because I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to eat it, because I'm like, well, this life goes on. And so, we don't always want to jump over those hurdles. And so sometimes you just have to say it. They're not just going to figure it out.
Yeah.
This is not going to happen that way. And it'll be more emotionally hurtful for you if you think you're dropping hints of I really want them to figure this out, so I'm going to say X, Y, and Z, or do A, B, and C, but not actually tell them anything.
You're just going to get more
because
frustrated.
Eventually they're not going to figure it out, and you're just going to be like, well, they just hate me and they just don't care about me, which isn't true. They, once again, have just been doing what they've been doing for, insert your age. And then now you're
Mm-hmm.
asking them not to do that thing. So you just have to come out and say it. And it can be awkward. But once again, if it really means something to you, and you want to be friends with them, or you want to improve that relationship, then you just have to say it and do it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just not an easy way to do it. You just have to say it. And it's, once again, goes back to who you have in your circle. It's much easier to say those things to people who are of the same character, because you know that they will agree. I meet with a couple of men every single week, and we did just kind of hang out and have a good time, and we discuss books that we're reading, and it was just an easy thing to say because we were all on the same page. And I was like, hey, I'm gonna talk about X, Y, and Z, but I'm not gonna make fun or talk negatively about my wife or y'all's wives and or family in any way. And that also helps because it kind of sets the precedent of maybe if I do start talking about something that is a struggle, they know that I'm not doing it out of like malice. It's also a vulnerability that we're now discussing, because we've all been in that, office or school environment where like someone's talking about their significant other and you're not quite sure if they're just like asking for help, or they're like making fun of them, or they're just like trying to be trendy and complain about their significant other, because I know like that truly is a thing that a lot of people do. So that's why I think it's important that who you have in your circle really also depends on how you set these boundaries and how you address that boundary with them. It might be in a different setting, it might be in one spot over the other, so it just really depends. And I personally like take setting boundaries with family the exact same way. It depends on the boundaries that I have with my brothers are going to be different than I have with my sisters. There's a reason why me and my brothers have a group chat just to ourselves, with the funny things that we want to talk about that our sisters or my mother would not find funny or probably even approve of. So boundaries can be personal, they can be hurtful, based on humor, emotional incidents, or spots in life. That's another reason why they're extremely difficult to figure out, because they are all over the place.
I think it's messier with family. We'll kind of transition into boundaries with family, but like Joseph said, like, for example, if you're setting boundaries with the people that should, I say should, know you most intimately, being family, that you've had more exposure to them just based on like time alone, that they should know these things about you, but don't really understand like your growth from like teenage years to adult years, that can be really difficult. I've even talked with other friends that like setting boundaries with adult parents as an adult child is very difficult, because you are now, depending on how you grew up, emotional trauma, childhood trauma, whatever, like you're now trying to rectify situations that may have never been safe for you as a child, but now have the voice to address them as an adult. And that's really scary. And I'm not talking about like being in danger or abuse, but same things of like, hey, like you joked with me about this particular topic, weight, whatever, my appearance, my clothes, my shoes, my voice, like any number of things that you didn't feel like you had the voice to address as a child. Like setting those boundaries as an adult and being like, hey, like at Thanksgiving or at holidays, because I know this is a topic I've had with several people of like during holidays talking about weight, and just the passive comments your sister or mother-in-law or other great aunt makes at the table over Thanksgiving dinner about watching her figure and all the food. Like setting boundaries with family, for example, being like, hey, like I'd really appreciate if we like didn't make comments about my body or my weight, or if you are going to do that, just not do that in my presence. It's really difficult, because I think when it comes to setting boundaries, you're also having to not only use your voice for what you need for you, but also take into account of like emotional intelligence of the other person, which is where I think like we get our hearts hurt and feelings hurt the most, is like hoping that maybe this other person is going to receive the boundary well, when in fact it might honestly blow up. And that's kind of what we'll talk about too, of like how to set the boundary when like the boundary doesn't seem to stick. But Joseph, do you think that, you said that you address boundaries the same way with your family, but would you say that there's like a different layer of messiness, I feel like, setting boundaries with family?
Yeah, and I approach it the same way. And, how I handle it specifically, yeah, it's probably absolutely different, even if there's things off the top of my head that I don't realize. But I approach it the same way, but it is, we talked about it on one of the other times that I was on one of the other podcast episodes when we were talking about marriage, and I, address maybe a way that you were raised and we discuss it and to change it, or how I was raised. What you're asking that person to do is really to change what they've been doing for their entire life.
Yeah.
And once again, I mentioned it earlier, like you're now asking your family member to set a boundary that they have never done your entire life. And boundaries go both ways. They can be pushed farther away, or they can be brought in closer. And there still is always just like this awkwardness, especially a boundary being brought in closer, because now you have to, and by closer I mean like
tighter consequences, you mean, or like stricter, I guess.
I'll just give the example I don't think of it in my head, since you all aren't up in there. I grew up with all of our siblings, parents knocked out of the park. Gotta make sure I say that up front. No complaints that I can even think of off the top of my head. Big difference between how Reyna and I grew up is like the show of affection. And so my family wasn't saying I love you every time we went somewhere. It wasn't hugs and kisses all around every time we went somewhere. If we were even like going over to a friend's house, it was just, slightly yelling across the room like, hey, we're leaving, spend the night, we'll be back tomorrow, whatever. And so, Reyna's family goes to Walmart and everybody gets up, hugs, kisses, love you, goodbye, the whole shebang, and I first meet Reyna, I'm in the house and I'm just like, what is happening right now? Like, is your family going on a trip, or are they just, what's going on?
No, we're just going somewhere.
So big differences. Neither is right over the other. There are obviously pros and cons to both of those things in the long run. And so it was, I don't even know how long ago it was, but in the past year, I was sitting living with my mom, and I was just like, hey, like, why didn't, you and Daddy say I love you as much? And I gave, the example of like what Reyna's family does. And so they didn't really set that boundary. Like, they didn't tell me when I was 5, like, we're not going to say this. That wasn't a thing. It naturally happens, or that's just kind of like a natural boundary that occurred. And so I now bring this topic up, and I'm pretty much asking them, why didn't you do this thing for me my entire life? And so that can be really awkward, because now you're asking your parent, why didn't you parent me in this way? This one specifically happens to be like with emotional affection. So, if handled improperly, it probably could have been terrible. My mom and I pretty much have the same personality in regards to like how we handle conflict. So like that conversation was not going to get spicy. And it basically just came down to, that just wasn't how they were raised, and that's not how we were raised. And it's something that we vocally said to each other, we want to do this better in the future, right? So that boundary was brought in closer to us. And so now it's something that we try to do.
Yeah, I think maybe what you mean is like bringing the boundary in closer is like adjusting the consequences maybe. So like an example of like setting a boundary maybe with a family member, whether it's like the weight conversation of like, say your great uncle smokes, and like for us, like we don't want smoking around us, just health problems or ledger or whatever. So it's like maybe for the first time in your life, you go to great Uncle Fred and you're like, hey, like, I know you always smoke when you come over for the holidays, but I would appreciate if you didn't smoke around our family. He may not take that very well. It may get really spicy, or he may be offended. He may throw a fit. He might be hurt. All other kinds of emotions. But I think and I've said it before, boundaries need to be communicated clearly. So explicitly, I do not want you to smoke around my family or in my home. So he might ask, well, can I smoke outside? You know what? Sure. But do not smoke in my home or around my family. So that the boundary is communicated clearly and consistently, because maybe the next time he comes to your house, he smokes. Maybe he totally forgot that you had set that boundary, or maybe he's going to try and push it because he thinks, oh, well, we're family. Like we just do this, and we just like make concessions for each other. You may have to set the boundary over and over and over again. So I feel like Joseph correct me on this, but when you say like bring the boundary in closer, I interpret that as like, if maybe the third time Uncle Fred is like, mind you guys, we don't have an Uncle Fred, but if Uncle Fred comes in the third time, still smoking, still breaking the boundary, and you're like, hey, Uncle Fred, we asked you consistently to not smoke in our home or around our family. It seems like you've forgotten or cannot do that. So if you cannot come to the next family event or family outing without smoking, you will not be invited to the next family event or whatever. So like, that's what I interpret as like bringing the boundary in closer, is like you have to get tighter with the consequence versus, I think maybe just like being able to extend things based on like how the other person receives the boundary.
Yeah. And just think of boundaries. I'll use it's fresh in my mind. Like Ledger, when we teach him something, he's doing it for the first time in his life. Mm-hmm. So there's a difference between going straight to consequences and just be like, hey, maybe let's not do this. Or like, can you go do that outside, please?
Mm-hmm.
It's just a simple yes. It's just a simple question. I need you to go out there and do this. Please go and do X, Y, and Z. And that's really how you can like easily communicate a boundary. Obviously, if you like put something off, that's when creating those boundaries become worse, because it's affecting you more and more emotionally. And
if you don't address it on the third try.
Right, if you don't address it, and then now you've got all this emotional tension. Potentially, it could be a couple of weeks. It could be quite literally years. Or decades.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it really becomes awkward. Whereas if it happens the first time, and then you're just like, hey, let's not do that, then they'll be like, oh, shoot, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it happens again, like Reyna said, maybe they did just forget. That's something like context really matters. Two things might mean one thing, and then one thing might mean two things. So, like, understanding they might have just forgotten. Because, once again, this is their second time in their entire life that you're asking them to do this. And that's where, like, your interpersonal tact, I know I used that word for, like, friends earlier, so I'll renege my comment. That's when your interpersonal tact with said person comes in, and like how you handle them, like your boundary that I guess that you set with them of I'm not going to yell at you or do X, Y, and Z with you. I'm just going to stay calm and ask you to do this, and if not, then you might not be around anymore.
Yeah. So how? I mean, we've had this conversation both personally with our family, friends, and navigating real life boundaries with our family and friends, but. How would you encourage someone to stick to the boundary when it stings? Like when Uncle Fred now like has a blow up in the middle, like it's awkward and messy, and now he's like throwing a fit or completely like cuts you out of the picture or stops calling, like I think with family, boundaries have a just like tidal wave kind of like ripple effect. Because, again, depending on, I think, emotional intelligence, the culture of your family, the conversations that you guys were able to have, boundaries are really unsettling, And especially if you have parents, not for any fault of their own, but were never experienced to, like, clear and healthy boundaries, this could be the first time that you're addressing them, which is also really difficult doing this as an adult child. So how would you encourage someone when setting the boundary really stings?
It's only going to get worse. I really don't know any other way to say that. You just kind of have to do it. It's like rolling a ball down the hill. You want to stop that thing within a foot of someone pushing the ball down the hill, or do you want to catch it with your face at the bottom of the hill?
Yeah.
You just got to stop it where it is. And once again, that's why it goes back to kind of like, hey, I don't like this. Maybe I should ask them to stop right now. Because there have been times where like Reyna does something, and even like in my head, I'm like, I don't think I like that, but I don't know if I don't like it, and I'm not gonna always ask her to stop. So I'll let it happen again, basically just like see how I feel. It might happen for like a week or two, over and over again, and then I'm like, hey, let's not do this. And then Reyna will be like, oh my gosh, I've been doing this for like 2 weeks, and that's when you've got to chime in and be like, I wasn't sure how I felt about it.
Yeah.
So if you're not sure how you feel about it, just let it pan out for a little while. Talk to someone else about it. Maybe that's not involved in the situation.
Or your spouse, if you're needing to make joint decisions for your family. If the boundary affects your family specifically.
Yeah. And then slightly making a joke here, slightly not. If you don't have anybody that you talk to, Reddit's anonymous. And lots of people answer questions on there. Just go to the Am I Overreacting subreddit. But anyways, but no, seriously. Go talk to someone else about it that's like not involved in it. Someone that you do have in your inner circle, and talk to them.
Yeah.
And you can be ambiguous about it. Like there are times that I have talked to Reyna about people, but they don't know that it's Reyna. I may phrase it from like, oh, I have a friend that does this, right? And then that's how I get their opinion, because I'm not in the business of, throwing Reyna under the bus or giving other people a negative view of Reyna, because that's the partner that like I'm trying to build up, and I would hope that they're also trying to build their partner up, because I also don't want them to have a negative opinion of her. Reyna's not waking up each morning
choosing violence.
Maybe not all the mornings choosing violence when she wakes up.
Sometimes choose violence.
And so sometimes you just have to approach that boundary and figure it out. And do I like this and do I not like this? And if you don't, you just have to approach it.
Yeah.
Like I said, like the emotional aspect isn't going to get any easier. You're just going to get more and more hurt and just think, why are they doing this? How can they not realize this? Because as mentioned earlier, as by Reyna, they may not know that this is a big deal.
Yeah.
They may have grown up with it their entire life and just thought it, even though they didn't like it when they were, X, Y, and Z age, now that they're older, they're like, oh, that's not a big deal. And then so now they're just going to do it to somebody else because, we've heard it all the time, quote unquote, I turned out fine.
Yeah.
So that kind of just like breaks one of the rules that I kind of like try to apply by and just be the thing that you wish you had. Would you appreciate someone else doing X, Y, and Z? If it's probably no, then probably don't do it.
And I think when it came to like boundaries in parenthood, because the episode's already getting kind of long, we'll wrap it up soon. But I think once we found out we were parents, we had to do a lot of just internal searching. And I think we did marriage counseling before Ledger was born to just kind of hash out these things of like, where do we stand on these as a family, as parents? Not only just between each other, but with other people. How are we going to approach this situation with friends? How are we going to approach this situation with family? Do we want people drinking or smoking around Ledger? Do we want people cussing around Ledger? Are we going to cuss around Ledger? Like just any, down to like the minute, like little things and little boundaries of like behavior to the big emotional baggage that comes with family or friends sometimes of like, hey, like this really hurt me, or this behavior is really hurting us or our family, or I don't want it replicated in our kids. Please stop, or like do it this way, or these are the options. And if you can't adhere to that, then like we're not going to be around. And unfortunately, we've set that boundary with friends and family before of like, hey, like if you can't stop the proverbial smoking around our son, then like you can't be around. And again, like setting those boundaries and fleshing them out with your partner or trusted advisors is crucial. And then if you're a believer, going back to scripture and saying like, oh, what does scripture say about this thing in particular? And I think really moving forward with peace as you make that boundary. But honestly, guys, like I feel like it's 10 times messier and harder with family. And that's why you have to go in concisely, explicitly. Don't beat around the bush, because things are already messy already if the boundary is unclear. And so you don't want to give that person any other leeway or any other option to interpret that boundary any other way, because you're only going to get hurt if they wiggle around it and you're frustrated because you didn't set it clearly. So setting the boundary clearly and concisely and consistently, because like Joseph said, this person might be hearing this for the first time and it's unsettling. So you might have to set the boundary over and over and over again and then adjust the consequences based on that. So as we wrap up, I wanted to talk on 3 specific hard boundaries that we have for our marriage in particular, and like how we, I think, just like protect our marriage with boundaries and other people, like just us against the world kind of things. And one of those things Joseph already touched on, and I think we mentioned it on another episode, is like venting to friends and family. I don't talk to my parents about Joseph. They're not the people that I go to when Joseph and I need to process something intimately, or we have a hard day or an argument. I'm not calling my mom or dad to say like, you wouldn't believe that Joseph did this, because at the end of the day, like everyone should really hear the best about Joseph. And I'll get into like the people that do help me process that, but I think it can be a really slippery slope, like we talked about on a previous episode. Like if you don't close the loop and you go and tell your mom or dad or best friend that Joseph did this and it really made me mad, and then you go home and I solve this with Joseph, we're totally fine. But the next time like your mom or dad or best friend sees Joseph, I can't keep that straight, but sees your spouse, and they might still be frustrated that you didn't close the circle, you didn't close the loop, you didn't go back to that friend or family member and be like, hey, like we actually resolved this and we're really good. They might be still bent out of shape. And so for us, our hard boundaries, we do not gossip or talk badly or process big heavy things about our spouse with our parents or a lot of our friends.
Yeah, I'm not going to really add too much because I've kind of already talked about it. But it's when you present something in a certain way over and over and over again, i.e. in a negative light, then that person's going to view that thing in a negative light. Or if they don't, they're going to view it in that way for you when you're around. So either way, you're setting a 50% picture for that person.
Yeah.
As Reyna mentioned, they might not know that you already solved the issue, got over it, and made headway on X, Y, and Z thing. And then the next time that person comes through the door, and your family, friends, or whatever now view that person in a negative light, which is why I mentioned, maybe getting advice like in a somewhat anonymous way, or in a way that they don't know that you're talking about your significant other.
Yeah, and I think that comes into like our second hard boundary is like we bring in wise counsel, and there are a lot of not even hoops but standards that we have for who gets to speak into those most intimate things. So like I'm not necessarily calling my mom or dad for things that Joseph and I need to work out, not because like I don't trust my mom or dad with that information, but like they are not necessarily seeing the most day-to-day and intimate things on like how we're doing life now, because we're in the military. We move every 2-3 years, and we don't even live in the same state, and a lot of people are only seeing snapshots. So when it comes to bringing in wise counsel on the things that we really need help on, it's one, we'll always support counseling. Having a marriage counselor is a huge support, even for the mundane things. Like if you guys need to learn how to communicate better, get a counselor. If you guys are working through trauma and big, heavy emotional things, grief, get a counselor. Like even just big life stages, moving for us, we wanted to go through counseling again together before Ledger was born, to set expectations in a just I think a healthy environment, and an objective, like having an objective voice as we're processing how we want to be parents was super helpful. And so I think one of the boundaries for us, I think kind of building off of that first one, is we have really high standards for what wise counsel looks like, and that means friends or a counselor that is walking intimately with us in the season that we're in, so that they can understand where we're coming from, what we might be struggling with currently, and having somebody that's biblically rooted to be able to approach the lens and approach our values similarly, so we feel encouraged in that conversation. So I think in terms of deciding like what you need for your counsel, a good place to start would just be one, go to counseling, but also decide between you and your spouse what standards you have for your counsel, so that you are able to bring those people in and you guys are both on the same page of like, Joseph knows I'm going to this person, and he's not like weirded out or awkward of like, oh, I'm so worried about like what they think of me or us processing this thing, because like Joseph knows the standards, we both know the standards for who we bring into these kinds of conversations. So it's not awkward when I'm like, hey, I'm processing this thing with this friend or this person. And he feels loved and supported, and knowing that I'm not venting, I'm not going behind their back, I'm not gossiping about him. I'm going to this person that he knows and also trusts to be able to process through the things that we need help on.
Yeah, not everyone is created equal. Like there have been counselors or advisors, whatever you want to call them, that we've gone to that we were like, wow, this is incredible. And then there's people that like I've walked into their like office and like within 3 sentences, it happened when I first got here. So I'm going to go check out this person at the Family Life Counseling Center or whatever. And like within a few minutes, I was like, this is not awesome, because I've got like 50 minutes left with this person. And I was just trying to get through that thing. And at the end, they were like, all right, well, let's set another one. And I was like, ooh, let me look at my schedule real quick, and I'll give you a call back. And I just never talked to that person again. So not all created equal. And then it's really hard to determine who you need to go to counseling for. Like this is just a really honest conversation that you have to have with yourself. Of, like Reyna said, are they rooted in the same thing that I'm rooted in, / what I want to be rooted in?
Yeah.
Because just because they're rooted in what you are doesn't mean they're going to give you good advice.
Yeah.
They may be shoulder to shoulder with you in the same shenanigans that you're struggling in. So maybe that's not the person. If I want to get better in shape, if I want to get better at running, I'm not going to go to someone that's running the same speed as I am, because that means they're also not doing super hot. So that person that you go to, you have to trust them to give you the right information, that they aren't just telling you what you want to hear. Because there are plenty of people out there that are concerned about your happiness or even their image and what the things that they're telling you. So that they might be telling you certain things because they just want you to be happy in the short term, not necessarily the long term, or because they want to be the person that's like giving you advice, because they depend on your emotional need for them. And so it varies. It varies on the person that you should go to. There are things that I'll go to my mother to, unrelated to my marriage, or related to my marriage. It 100% depends on the situation. And there are things that we've had counselors, things that we bring up to them, things that we don't, just based on who that person is. Yeah. And so it's really hard because, and I'm not being very specific, but it's really hard to be specific on the things that you bring to certain people and the things that you don't. But if I was to give like a principle guideline by it, it would be based on if you think they're going to give you unbiased opinion and are looking out for you in the long run. Because there are people who are very broken in this world, and they may be, I've been going to counseling for X, Y, and Z years for this situation. And pain, suffering, emotional trauma is all relative, so I'm not here to like say, just get over it. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. But if there's a point in time where someone has been counseling you for years, once again, maybe they're not the person that should be talking to you, because clearly they don't know how to counsel you. Once again, that point there is very relative. There are things that are traumatic for years on end based on a certain situation. So it's not, that comment is not applicable to everything. But if you have someone that's just counseling you / churning the negativity in you and what is happening, that can be a negative factor and actually hurt things. There's plenty of studies out there that show that going to counseling consistently and often and having a person just making you discuss your issues is not helpful at all. And that's why that person needs to be giving you unbiased feedback on how to get better. It's not just for you to work things out in your head. It's so that you can actually go out and walk out those doors of whatever building you're in and actually go fix your life and make it better. It's not just about talking through your issues. That's part of it. That's the first step. But you literally just have to go out there and try and be better.
Yeah, that's the tangible steps I think that come out of counseling too. And again, Joseph hit the nail on the head that it'll be based on your context and what that healing looks like, but we'll always be big proponents of counseling. And so one of the last things that we have as a hard boundary, I think that's really manifested probably in the past 6 months, is that we approach vulnerability in our marriage with gentleness. And this is, I would say, a boundary for me more than anything, because like Joseph said, I'm a little bit more hot-headed or emotional. I'm a little bit more trigger happy and passionate. I don't say really I'm angry, but I'm passionate about more things. And so a boundary for our marriage specifically is that when we're coming to each other to reassess boundaries, explain and manage expectations, or address conflict, we are trying to approach it with a spirit of gentleness, because I wasn't always that way. And so that's a hard boundary we've had to set in place recently of like, in order to communicate and love each other well, this has to be the bottom line. I mean, this boundaries ultimately are the bottom line, how you want to move forward with people in your relationships. And gentleness is one of those big things for me, at least I've been working on.
Yeah, once again, I said it earlier, and I think I said it in the past podcast, it just comes down to you being the thing that you wish you had. You wouldn't want your partner to come in and steamroll a conversation because of what they want. You want your partner to come in and have a conversation that'll manifest in something that both of you want in the long run. And when Reyna and I talked about this before, I mean like just thinking of that bullet to discuss. I brought it up actually as a talking point from the perspective of, the differences in how people are raised or how they think of things. If you just come in to change things, what you're just telling them, that person, is that you're just wrong, and there's no discussion about it, and you don't always know everything as an individual to make those decisions.
Yeah, that was so good. I would say closing thoughts for this. Again, one, we don't know your marriage. And this is the boundaries that we've talked about specifically are what have worked in our marriage. They're a constant conversation. We evaluate them all the time, aside from like gossiping about our spouse. That's just like a hard and fast one we set since we got married. But boundaries are they're just messy and they're hard, both with friends, families, within your marriage, with your spouse. But I think I've said it multiple times, boundaries come down to evaluating what you need, kind of being a little bit of extra selfish sometimes, and communicating them concisely and clearly and consistently, because if you're not communicating them clearly, then you're probably dropping a lot of hints and being passive aggressive because of the sake of not wanting to hurt someone's feelings or be a little bit too direct or whatever the situation may be. But instead, you're getting more hurt and you're getting more frustrated. And if you're not following up the conversation consistently, then you're not being direct. You're not following through on your consequences. You're not, this may not really, the other person may interpret that as, oh, this may not really be as big of a deal as you think it is. In the meantime, like, you're stewing every time you see that person because they broke your boundary. So I think the most healthy and loving thing for both relationships inside and outside of your marriage is evaluating what you need. And then when it comes to your marriage, like, coming to those understandings together. So between what Joseph and I need for our marriage to work and our relationship to be healthy between each other, as well as what does our relationship need to be healthy as we interact with the relationships around us, friends, family, work, environment, all those things.
And boundaries may be a weird thing for you to wrap your head around. Like I mentioned earlier, you might not like the idea of it because it sounds a little too like new age and emotional or whatever. But at the end of the day, all of us can probably agree that we would really appreciate it if someone took the time to try and figure out how to properly love us and interact with us and figure out what things we do and don't like to talk about. And our relationships and interactions with others will only improve if we do that same thing. It's not, dismissive or a beta move to try and do those things. It'll actually create a lot more like meaning and close friendships in your life and purpose. And like a belonging when you do that. Then you'll start to figure out who you actually really enjoy talking to.
Yeah. Well, guys, this episode I know has been something that you guys were excited for a while, so I'm glad we finally got to do it. It's a little bit long, so if you need to take it in pieces, I hope you enjoy it. I will link some of our favorite just resources in terms of books that we've read that explicitly talk about boundaries as well as biblical boundaries and how to navigate that. I'll just say off the top of my head, Dr. Nedra Tawwab, I think that's how you pronounce her last name, has 2 beautiful books. One was her first on creating boundaries, and then the second one is family drama, which kind of makes me laugh because when I first read the book, I was like, oh, she must know my entire life. But it was really practical steps on how to navigate messy family life. So I'll link that in the show notes on the website as well. And just some other really great resources that I've read through, handed to friends, had family read, that have just encouraged me in this conversation as we've navigated this conversation, both as a couple, as a family, and then with all the other voices outside of our marriage. Have any closing thoughts, babe?
No.
It's good stuff.
Yeah, I can't really say I have any like specific books or anything. Boundaries become a lot easier thing to do when you have experiences or like see other things. There are days where like one of us is out of the house or we're out of the house together and we see something or that another couple does or another parents do to their kids, and we're just like, well, we're not going to do that. So boundaries become easier when you also see other things and other people, you really can't go wrong with many like books, or I'll just say the Bible, based on like its principles of like loving one another, on how to like actually portray boundaries or interpersonal tact, whatever flavor you prefer to have. But the end result is the same.
Yeah. I think going back to the word, like I said, wrap it full circle from the beginning. That the scripture, going back to scripture for us was the key to the foundation that set our marriage, that has lasted, regardless of what people said, was us going to scripture both individually and together and fighting for our marriage and kind of setting the boundaries of like, hey, like this is cool and this is not cool and this is why, biblically, but also I think it taught us the discipline to fight for those things together, and that I think has created the most loving way that we approach boundaries is because we approach them together as a family, a partnership. So thanks, babe. It's a good episode. I'll link all those things for you guys in the show notes, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you for listening, friend. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you don't want to miss any wisdom or encouragement, be sure to subscribe to the show. And don't forget to rate and review. Your feedback means so much and helps our community grow. If you're looking for more wellness wisdom and free resources, head over to livingwiselywell.com or get connected with me on Instagram at wiselywell. And if you're looking for a break from the hurried health lifestyle, check out my Return to Rest resource for tangible ways to slow down and finally find rest.